you've got to feed the kids, right? You've got to feed your family. And if there's no food and the only people who've got the food are Allied soldiers, you've got to have something that you can trade with them. What do they need? They don't need anything. All their needs are provided for by the army. So, yeah, there's only one thing really you've got to sell. And the women did in their thousands.
Hello. Within months of the Allies' liberation of Naples in October 1943, the city was plunged into the horrors of disease, starvation, prostitution, and racketeering. How did this happen? Who was responsible? What about the mafia? And what was the impact on a city that is despised by the rest of Italy, and itself views the world very differently from other Mediterranean cities? Joining is Keith Lowe, author of Naples 1944, an account of the chaos that resulted from what was supposed to be a release from the misery of occupation. Plenty more great history on the way, so please do follow, subscribe, and if you can, leave a kind, gentle, or even generous review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I'd be very grateful. But until then, I'll hand you over to me talking with Keith Lowe on Naples. Keith, welcome to the podcast. It's a great pleasure to have you on, and we're talking Naples 1944, war, liberation, and chaos.
Absolutely. War, liberation, and chaos. Three for the price of one.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, it's heartbreaking reading sections of this book, as you tend to write books about really quite kind of difficult subjects. I mean, Hamburg, the bombing of Hamburg, and then Savage Continent about Europe after the Second World War. I'm interested, why do you go for books that are more about, not about the actual military side of things, but the effect of war? Am I right in saying that what really gets you going?
Absolutely. I never served in the military. I don't pretend to be a military man or to know particularly that much about sort of units and weapons and so on. What interests me is how ordinary people like you and me are affected by extraordinary events, and there is no greater and more extraordinary event than the Second World War. So, I can't help but imagining myself in the place of people who were there and thinking, how would I act if bombs were falling around me, or if someone was shooting at my family? What would I do? How would I? What sort of choices would I make? So that's kind of the subjects that get me going.
Yeah, and Naples, I mean, the Italian experience of the Second World War is interesting. I mean, because Italy itself it's Naples is probably a great example of, it's quite a divided country. And Naples, particularly, you have the Italian, that the abuse that is hurled at Napoli football fans. And so listeners might be familiar, Naples has almost, I mean, the south of Italy is kind of looked down upon by those in the north. But I think Naples are even more so looked down upon almost by everyone, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean they've got a really bad and not deserved reputation, actually. You know, like you said, whenever the Naples football fans go to any other part of the country, they chant, the other football fans always chant to them, Napoli merda, Napoli colera, sei la vergogna dell'Italia intera. So Naples shit, Naples cholera, you're the shame of the whole of Italy. And that's just like I I know you can't judge everything by football chants, but it is as succinct as you can get about prejudices about Naples.
And it does
uh,
go both ways. I mean, I remember, and we're going off slightly on a tangent, but Maradona played for Napoli, and he always said that he felt a real connection with the people of Napoli, unlike anywhere else in Italy, because he felt like they were sort of there was a kind of a siege mentality.
yeah, Yeah, it's sort of like the perpetual outsiders, underdogs, and so on. And I, there is a little bit of that mentality in Naples still today. You know, that they've had a hard time out of history. They have been ruled by everybody. Uh, they've never really been in charge of their own destiny. Not during the 15th century, not during the. Yeah, there was a small period where under the Bourbon kings, they sort of felt like they were in charge of their own destiny. But those kings were pretty awful to the people as well. But there's still this sort of nostalgia even now for the Bourbon kings as like a moment when they had their king and their um, society under their own control. It was only a sort of brief century or so, century and a half. Um, yeah, so they've got a sort of there are a lot of Neapolitans with a bit of a chip on their shoulder when it comes to the rest of Italy and the rest of Europe. Um, but the flip side of that coin is they've got the most incredible sense of humor as well. They're really they've got this sort of dark, very funny sense of humor, which always involves the underdog kind of finding a way through, arranging things to suit himself. At the expense of the rich, snobbish, aristocratic sort of outsiders and northerners and northern Europeans who come down to Naples on holiday and so on. There's always like a sort of sneaky way of getting round um, the outsiders.
And you know Naples quite well, then. I got that sense in from the book. I mean, not. I'm going beyond your research, which I
Yeah,
presumably began 3 or 4 years ago.
yeah. I mean, I've known it since I was a child. Really, I always used to go on holiday there or thereabouts every summer, 5 weeks in a tent with four brothers and sisters. um, so yeah, I mean, I grew up. We made dozens of family friends from this area who used to tell us stories about what happened during the war, and that kind of ignited my interest, even as a child. For example, there was a guy called Ferdinando who told us about a massive explosion in wartime Naples, which was so big it had tanks flying through the air and landing on the tops of houses, and we kind of took this with a pinch of salt when we were growing up, but actually it turns out doing the research for the book that this was an event that did happen. It was an ammunition ship that blew up in the harbour because of fascist incompetence. Someone let a fire start burning on this um, ship, and none of the port authorities could be contacted because they were too busy celebrating in a party somewhere. And so it was left to burn, and it blew up. And the explosion was so big, it did indeed throw tanks through the air, which landed on people's houses. Astonishing. But these are the kind of stories that I grew up with and that I wanted to bring to life in this book.
Okay, so Naples, I was interested in this because Italy during the war, obviously, it begins the war allied with Nazi Germany under Mussolini. But Naples itself, it wasn't a particularly fascist stronghold, was it, for Mussolini's party?
Well, no, yes and no. I mean, it was
Mm.
actually before the war. It was a very communist stronghold actually in the 1920s. Lots of industry around Naples, so there were lots of unions that were very strong. It's not only communists, also socialists, and so quite sort of left-leaning city. But then, of course, as in any city, there's always the opposite. So there were very strong individual fascists who set up a fasci around Naples and did the same things that they did up north. Went out with clubs, going to union meetings and beating everybody up, taking any political rivals and sometimes beating them to death, intimidating the local populations into sticking with the fascists, and so on. And so those people were the reason why Mussolini came to Naples before his march on Rome, and it was in Naples that he announced it in the San Carlo Theatre. He said we're going to march on Rome, and that's where they began. So there was definitely a very strong fascist element alongside its polar opposite in Naples before the war.
But when the Allies arrive, I mean, the Germans have fled because obviously the Italians had flipped sides, having overthrown Mussolini a bit before, hadn't they?
Now that's a whole kettle of fish there. I
Oh,
mean,
I've done that in a kind of, sweeping statement that a podcaster would do just because it's simple and makes it nice and clear. Yeah, it's not as simple as that,
is
is it?
no. Well, I mean, the Italians realise that they're losing the war. They know that the Allies are coming. They've already landed in Sicily, so they've got to do something. And you know, so they make an armistice with the Americans and the British, but they know also that the Germans aren't going to like this, and they've got several divisions of um, German soldiers in the south of Naples, in the south of Italy, and so they don't want to antagonize them. So they try to keep this armistice secret. Well, you can't keep an armistice secret, especially when the Allies are about to land on the mainland. Either you're going to fight against them or you're not. And if you're not, then everyone's going to know. The Germans weren't stupid. They knew this was going on. They had intelligence it was going on. They knew the Allies were going to land. And as soon as the armistice was announced on radio, they pounced on all the Italian units in everywhere, and either made them give up their guns and go home, or anybody who resisted was then kind of massacred, really. And there were several instances of garrisons around Naples that tried to resist this German takeover, and they were, there were atrocities everywhere as the Germans took over. So when the Allies are there, they land at Salerno. Um, Effectively, the Germans have got control of Naples and the whole surrounding area. What then arises is the local civilian population rise up against the Germans, and in Naples they're actually successful. So it's not just a matter of the Germans running away in front of the Allies. It's the local population who are kicking them out of Naples. There's this big uprising, the 4 Days of Naples, it's called, where it's the first popular uprising against the Germans in the whole of mainland Europe, apart from, I should say, one or two ghetto uprisings in Poland. But the whole of the rest of Europe, this is the first time the local people rise up and kick the Germans out of the cities. It's really quite surprising that we don't know more about this, because it is a big deal. It's a big deal in Naples, at least. It's less of a big deal in the rest of Italy for various reasons. But we in Britain and America have never heard of it. It's huge uprising. Let
We
us
have
know.
now, Keith. We
We
are
have now, and
we
rightly
have
so.
now, thanks to your book. But this is the thing. I've assumed before reading your book that the Allies liberate a city, and then everything's fine, and then they move on to their next objective. Meanwhile, because the Nazis have been removed, it's happy days. But this is not the case at all. I mean, your book is called Naples 1944, but Naples it's liberated in October, 1st of October, isn't it?
1st of October 43, exactly.
Okay, we're going to talk about this, but the Germans pretty much destroy the city before they go, don't they?
Yeah, brutal what they do.
I mean, that wasn't necessarily something that they repeated elsewhere. Was there something about Naples that caused them to do that? Or was it simply because this was the first major European city that fell to the Allies? And so this was almost a kind of a statement that the Germans were going to make?
There's an element of revenge involved. I mean, this is just after the Italians switched sides. So they want to make it clear that that's not acceptable. But mainly it's about scorched earth policy. I mean, they did the same in Naples as they were doing in Eastern Europe as they were withdrawing from Russia. They destroyed anything that could be of use to the Allies. And that included hotels, anywhere that could billet soldiers. So hotels, schools, big public buildings were blown up. The port facilities were completely destroyed. They put booby traps all the way around all the docks. They blew up all the cranes. They sank 300 ships in the harbour and around the docks, and then sowed mines everywhere to try and stop Allied ships coming in. They even went as far as blowing up the water mains and the sewers in the city to deny any kind of clean water supply. So when the Allies arrive, yeah, happy days. They've got here. The war's over for a bit, but in the meantime, how are you going to live? You've got no food, there's no transport, everything's been blown up, you've got nowhere to live, and there's no clean water to drink. So yeah, it's not going to be happy days for a while, unfortunately.
Well, no, I mean, with no water, I mean, disease is the most pressing, I guess, problem. And in particular, there's a typhus epidemic.
Yes.
Do we know how many people that would have killed?
Got the figures in my book. I don't know them off the top of my head, but it was in the hundreds, not quite the thousands, fortunately, because, well, I mean, the Allies, they did delay. They should have acted a lot more quickly than they did. They tried to sort of pretend that it wasn't happening for a month or two, at which point the disease started escalating exponentially. At that point, they called in a special typhus commission from America, who brought with them tons of DDT powder, which they used to sort of dust the entire population of Naples. Imagine this, like 900,000 people being dusted with powder to kill the little bugs, the lice that are spreading this disease. And, of course, at that time, they had no idea about the dangers of DDT, but it certainly worked on the insects, killed the insects, stopped the outbreak in its tracks. It was incredible. And as a consequence of that, this was the first time this had ever been done on such a scale. And as a consequence of that, they every time they liberated any city from then on, anytime they liberated a concentration camp or a prison camp, DDT would be the first thing they did. They dust everybody with DDT, and it's probably the main reason why there wasn't a major epidemic of typhus across Europe, because they were doing this. So it was kind of wonder drug, really, a sort of miracle powder. This stuff.
Added to the fact that there's disease, there's also mass starvation, and we'll talk about the consequences of that. But you have the Allies who seem to have, certainly the troops, have limitless amounts of food for themselves. One wonders how they dealt with the disease pretty effectively, but weren't so effective in dealing with hunger. And why was that?
Yeah, this was a real problem, and they never quite got to grips with it. They had this idea that Naples was going to easily feed itself because it's surrounded by some of the most fertile land in the world, volcanic soil from Vesuvius. So they had this idea that it'd be fine. They didn't need to really provide much food. Um, Unfortunately, no matter how fertile the soil is, a lot of it had been, a lot of the farmland had been churned up by tanks and whatever. But the main problem is that nobody could get the food from the countryside into the city because all of the transport systems have been completely destroyed. So there's no way of getting the food in to the city in the first place. So you end up with sort of people grabbing a knapsack and a bicycle and heading out into the countryside and sort of walking for 3 days to find some food and then carrying it all the way back again for another 3 days and feeding their families and then selling whatever else they had on the black market. But as you say, in the meantime, Allied soldiers had food to spare. They had loads of the stuff, and happily used it to bribe the local women into sleeping with them and so on. So yeah, I mean the sort of mismanagement of the food situation was a real problem for at least a year after the liberation. People were starving at least a year. It was only sort of in the summer of 1944 they finally got to grips with appointing an officer in Allied forces headquarters to deal with this crisis, despite everybody clamoring, saying, this is a problem. We need help. We need help. They didn't get round to appointing a specific officer to deal with civilian hunger for 10 months. It's unbelievable mismanagement.
Yeah, is this because, I mean, Mark Clark's the sort of the Allied commander, isn't he?
Yeah.
Is he? I mean, obviously he's got to deal with the Germans. That's
Yeah,
his
of course.
but I mean, this must be a failure that one can lay at his door, surely.
Well, it, I'm Mark
I mean, he
Clark's
doesn't
biggest.
have to do it himself. He can appoint the officer sort of a few months earlier than he did. He must have been aware of
Well,
the.
yeah, it's not just down to Mark Clark, you see. Part of the problem is there's no clear structure for who's going to be dealing with this. So you've got Mark Clark, who's in charge of Fifth Army. He's got his headquarters at Caserta, just north of Naples. Then you've got the Allied military government of Naples itself. They've got their headquarters within Naples, but they're sort of reporting to Mark Clark, but they're also reporting to 15th Army Group, which is based in Bari on the other side of Italy. And they're the ones who are supposed to be supplying everything. Then you've got the Italian government, which are based in Brindisi. And then you've got the overseers of the Italian government, who are based first in Palermo and then in Salerno. And then you've got Allied Forces headquarters, which is all the way over in Algiers. Now, none of these places are talking to each other. Nobody knows who's got priority. And the only people really who can arrange the shipping space to get more food into Naples are those people all the way over in Algiers. So you've got to get the message there, and you've got to get someone there to listen to it. And then those people have then got to get authorization from Washington and London. I mean, just the whole thing is so mired in bureaucracy that nothing gets done and people starve as a consequence. That's what I mean by sort of incompetence. There's no clear line of command which can sort this problem out.
In the opening chapter on the subject of prostitution, in the opening paragraphs, you write about the banquets that Clark holds. This is fiction. I should. Who's the author? I've forgotten his name. Is it The Skin? The title of
Yes,
the.
yes, Curzio Malaparte. Yeah.
Yeah, so which I now really want to read as well.
Oh
After
no, I recommend it. Great book. It's very
right.
sort of gothic book, but a grotesque book, but
Yes, well,
excellent.
I'll put links in if any readers are interested in that as well as Keith's. But you have the deal is you have to buy Keith's first and then the Skin. But you mentioned this sort of grotesque. It's a grotesque novel. I mean, it's grotesque reading about. So the idea being that because there's no fishing, the Allies have banned fishing. Why is that? Is that because they just want to preserve food, the food for the troops, or why is that?
No, they're trying to keep the coastal areas clear of any ships, so that people don't get blown up by mistake, or nobody can sabotage them disguised as a fishing vessel. So
Makes
yeah,
sense.
yeah, exactly.
But but in the novel, Clark is feeding his sort of VIP visitors with fish from the aquarium, which turns out that's actually, I mean, not. I think you've established in this book that that's not really true, is it?
No, it's not. And you know, it's an easy mistake to make because, in fact, in Savage Continent, I stated that it was true, um, based on Norman Lewis's memoirs, who says that it's true, but it turns out it's not. He was taking it from rumors that were around Naples at the time, and from this novel. This novel was, I mean, it was published post-war, but so was Norman Lewis's memoir, sort of 30 years later. So somewhere along the line, this sort of fiction has turned into a myth, which has then turned into memory, and which eventually finds its way into our history books, including one of my previous ones. So that, which is embarrassing. So yeah, I tried to make sure I corrected it in this because if you look at the newspapers at the time, the aquarium remained open throughout the Allied period. You could go along, pay 20 lira, and go and see the fish, which were all still there, swimming away. And yes, these big fish banquets of Mark Clark never happened.
But the Neapolitans, presumably, that would be a perfect example for their. Okay, if I say the word victimhood, that does imply it's kind of not legitimate, but it would be an example that they probably did repeat post-war. That this is what we had to go through, and all the while, the Allies were eating our special fish. Was it part of the myths within Naples itself
Well,
that went beyond the history books?
it's a myth just because it's a myth. That it's
Shouldn't overthink
embraced.
this.
It's embraced because it kind of speaks to a greater truth, which is
Yeah.
that people of Naples were starving, and everybody remembered that. So it was just a sort of like a shorthand to describe how desperate everybody was. The fact that it, strictly speaking, isn't true is sort of in their minds neither here nor there. We were starving. That's what matters.
Well, one of the results of this starvation was prostitution. And there's a photograph in the book, and it's of, I think, some American troops with two women who presumably they're about to pay or already have. And you just think it's a photograph with one US soldier taking a picture of his comrade and he's got his arms around the women. I thought, okay. But then when you look closer, it's really horrible. He's got his hands on each one breast of each woman. It's really quite disgusting. And that really sort of hit home the experience of for a lot of these women in during that time.
Yeah, you've got to feed the kids, right? You've got to feed your family. And if there's no food and the only people who've got the food are Allied soldiers, you've got to have something that you can trade with them. What do they need? They don't need anything. All their needs are provided for by the army or the navy or the air force. So yeah, there's only one thing really you've got to sell, and the women did in their thousands. Some of the statistics, I mean, it's probably about, I mean, the official number they came up with is about 40,000 women prostituting themselves on a part-time basis to the Allies at any one time.
And was that the civil authority that came up with that figure, or
Yeah,
is
that,
it?
that was that was British intelligence actually who came up with that figure with using police reports and so on. Uh, they there were already sort of official brothels, licensed brothels long before the Allies got there, but these were sort of unofficial prostitution, which was just cropping up everywhere. Unofficial brothels. 12,000 women were arrested for prostituting without a license just in 1944. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's plenty more who don't get rounded up and taken away. So, I mean, it just shows the scale of the problem. That's 10% of the female population, and if you factor out, old ladies and children, you're probably talking about 1 in 7 women having
Arrested,
to no, not arrested, no, having to prostitute themselves.
participating?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I kind of hesitate to remove old women and children from that because they also were caught up in this, and there's some quite disgusting stories that I came across of Allied soldiers openly admitting that they'd slept with children, sort of bragging about it in some ways. Um, After the war, some of it's really quite stomach churning.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's another photograph that I think of a what must the there's a little boy, must be 7 or 8, urinating against a wall with a cigarette. It's a
Yeah,
fantastic photo. I don't.
yeah,
You must. Well done for finding that. But that again, were they called skinietti?
Skuniezi, yeah,
Skuniezi.
yeah, yeah,
Skuniezi. It's
exactly.
just sort of little imps
Yes,
going around the.
urchins. Yeah,
Yeah.
there was a U.S. naval photographer who was sent out into the city, and he's took a whole series of pictures of the children of Naples, and that's one of those pictures. All of them are. I mean, he's a particularly interesting one because he's like a sort of, I don't know, it's like a kid from Bugsy Malone or something. He's there with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth and he's peeing against the wall, and you can just imagine the mischief he gets up to. But there are heartbreaking pictures of kids, little girls crying in the streets, kids with sort of limbs blown off, children, eating out of trash cans, that kind of thing. It's heartbreaking what the children of Naples had to go through during the Allied occupation of the city.
Yes, yes. And then in addition to that, there's the black market. So inevitably, Naples is famous nowadays in one way for its mafia connections. It's I remember staying with a family from just south of Naples, and they just described the mafia as their, or the Gomorrah as they called it, as their shame. Presumably, with the black market during 1944, they are right there involved.
Well, yes, they are. But actually, most of the black market is being run by Allied soldiers. This is the thing. It's the Allied soldiers teaming up with local people who can then sell on the stuff that they're nicking from Allied stores. And and it's only after the war that those people, because the mafia had been pretty much defeated at the beginning of the century in Italy, certainly in mainland Italy, even in lots of Sicily as well. And it's only the arrival of the Allies, who have quite the same brutal methods that some of the Italian authorities used, and also come with all this stuff to sell, that they set up these new networks all over again. So people selling off Allied goods then gradually in 1945 start turning into the new Camorra and mafia, and new networks start up again, and this whole sort of crime scene begins again. My main problem, I think, with the fact that so many people are starving is that there is this vast amount of stuff coming through the port, and so much of it is going missing and going onto the black market. I mean, there was at one point in 1944 when 30% of all the stuff coming through Naples port went missing. It never made it to the warehouse it was destined to. 30%. And this is at a time when Naples is the biggest supply port in the world. So you can imagine the sheer volume of stuff that's going missing. Now, if the
And millions
Allies,
and millions of tons,
millions
presumably.
of tons, exactly. So, I mean, and all the Allied reports are saying, well, thank God in a way, because at least through the black market, the people of Naples are getting some food to eat. But if they'd have just taken that stuff in the first place and sold it on the legitimate market for sensible prices,
Or even
then
giving it away, yeah.
or even given it away because it's going missing anyway, right? Then the people of Naples wouldn't be starving, and you wouldn't end up with all these gigantic criminal networks being born out of the war. So it's easy to say these things, of course, now, but the sheer mismanagement at the time is staggering. It's breathtaking.
But it doesn't sound like there's any kind of acknowledgement of it either. I mean, as you say, we're only really learning about this stuff, now. If the Allies had attacked a bridgehead or something and it had all gone wrong, then there's a sort of investigation to work out why that went wrong so that they won't go wrong again. But nothing like that was happened after Naples then.
No, I mean they did have an investigation into the port, and try to work out where everything was going, and they found that they didn't even have the most simple checklists. You unload something from a ship, you have a checklist to make sure it's all there, and then as you load it onto the truck, you have a checklist, and then when you load it off the truck, you follow the same checklist. They didn't even have that very simple system. And so investigators who went there just threw their hands up in horror and said, "This is crazy. We've got to redesign everything. You just can't run a port like this." So there was a sort of internal investigation, but obviously this isn't going to be made public during the war. So it's sort of hushed up, and it never really comes out until memoirs like Norman Lewis's sort of highlight it a little bit, and I'm highlighting it here. But this is the sort of information that doesn't normally make it into your average history of the war, because most people are interested in the battles that are going on, not in the disastrous logistics which are supposed to be supplying those battles.
Yes, it's so strange because you're right. When we're reading, I mean, we've just done a series on Operation Market Garden that, whilst it wasn't a massive success, everything seemed hyper organized. They knew what they were doing. Everyone had what they needed to do it. But here, it's like chaos. It's
Yeah, and there are people on the front line who are not getting the supplies they need because it's all
30%
being
getting
pilfered.
nicked. Yeah.
It's all getting pilfered before it gets to them. So people on the front line are struggling for lack of rations and cigarettes and
Even
whatever.
ammunition?
Well, yeah, I mean, it never gets that bad. I mean, the thing is that the US have such a vast amount of stuff that that they can kind of get away with it. That enough gets to the front for them to get the job done. When you read the statements by German prisoners of war, who they're fighting on their front lines, and they think they're better soldiers. They don't really rate the American soldiers. They don't even rate the British soldiers that much. But when you get them captured and they get brought back behind the lines and they see the sheer wealth of material and rations and so on pouring through, that's when they say, well, at that point, I realized we were always going to lose the war, because there's no way they could compete with that. It's the volume of stuff, the volume of material that wins the war, rather than the the quality of the soldiers and so on.
Yeah, the sheer industrial might of America is
Exactly,
right.
exactly the
But
arsenal
okay,
of democracy.
yes, yes, yes. Yeah, well put. Yeah. So now, is it fair to say that one of the reasons why Naples has this sort of unique character that it does now, because of the experience in the Second World War in 1944, in that, it was liberated by the West, but it wasn't a kind of liberation like Paris or other cities?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the thing about Paris is that it's planned a long time in advance. It's quick. The invasion of Normandy through to the liberation of Paris, it's only a couple of months, 3 months, I think it is. The invasion of Italy is a lot slower. It becomes bogged down in the problem with going up Italy is that every sort of 20 miles you get another massive river to cross, or another mountain range, and it just goes on and on and on all the way up. So there's the defensive positions are so strong that they can't make any progress. So things get bogged down, and people lose interest, and it's not glamorous anymore. It's just bitter and horrible. Whereas France is sort of nice and quick, and it's the main thrust towards Germany and Berlin, so it gets all the glamour.
But the result of that is that it leaves the Neapolitans feeling like, oh, okay, so this is what liberation is like. This isn't that great.
Well,
And that feeling has sort of remained. I mean, what I mean is that is one of the reasons why Naples different to other Italian cities today, because I think it is, isn't it?
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Because
But it
of
has always been different. I mean,
right.
it was Naples was its own kingdom. The south of Italy was its own kingdom for centuries. And it was only when Garibaldi came through and united the country, um, by marching into Naples in 1860, um, that it became part of Italy, really. But they still kind of feel like they're separate from everybody else. They've got their own history.
Is there any
But
resentment to the Allies?
well, yeah, I mean that's the thing. The Second World War compounded that feeling of being separate, because once again you have this southern Italian kingdom which is separate from all of the north, which is still under the control of the Germans. And uh, the way the Allies treated the Italians was quite, you've got to remember there were enemies until recently, so there's a lot of mistrust between both sides. The British especially don't really know how to treat the Italians in the early days, because they've been fighting heavy battles with them in North Africa up until recently. And there are all these kind of diktats that come from Churchill and London, about how the Italian government should be run, and they're determined to keep the king in place when all the Italians, and even in the south, hate the king at the time. They're determined to keep Pietro Badoglio in place, who's a fascist sort of war criminal, and he's kept on as prime minister. That they want these people purged. They want to have them arrested, hopefully, and tried. But instead of that, they're being held in government by the Allies, and particularly by the British. So the longer this goes on, the more resentment is felt. So, whereas in the north of Italy, when the north was liberated by the British and the Americans, and also by the resistance, they saw what had happened in the south, saw that there hadn't been any kind of purge, and so they decided to take the law into their own hands. So they took fascists out round the back, shot them against the wall, because they had no faith whatsoever that there would be any kind of purge. And it was Naples that taught them that. So what happens in Naples not only has an effect on the resentments that are felt in the south of Italy, it also has an effect on the atrocities which then happen post-war in the north of Italy.
Now, presumably, with the sheer amount of prostitution that took place, there were many fatherless children then after the war.
Yes, yes, but fatherless children weren't entirely unusual anyway in Naples. There was all kinds of it's a very, very overcrowded and historically fairly poor city that so they had social problems before the Allies turned up, of course. But nevertheless, what made it different now is that you could tell which children were illegitimate because a lot of them had black soldiers as fathers, and there wasn't an indigenous population of black people really at the time. So you could tell just by looking at the babies which ones were definitely illegitimate. To their credit, though, the Neapolitans kind of took this in their stride. They didn't. There was not the sort of prejudice that you would imagine those children growing up in the same way that there might have been in other countries. They kind of took them to their breast, and Neapolitans love children. Doesn't matter the color. What the hell, we're all one really. And so they brought them. There are all kinds of comic songs about this which come out in the 1950s that about families that suddenly there's a black child that turns up in the family. Where did that come from? And it's all sort of supposed to be very funny, but we brush it under the carpet and all celebrate anyway. Hooray! It's a lovely, beautiful baby boy. That
And
sort of
so,
thing.
when you were visiting the city, what kind of reception did you have? Were people sort of presumably delighted that you're writing about the city's experience?
Yes, absolutely. I love Naples and I love Neapolitans. They're great people. They let you know if they don't like you in no no uncertain terms. But if they're pleased and they're happy, they will be more enthusiastic than anyone else. They're lovely people, very funny, wear their hearts on their sleeves, and here am I, some bumbling Englishman wandering around an archive trying to find his way and speaking sort of dodgy Italian, and they were delighted by it. They just loved the idea that somebody was from the West, from Britain, was at last paying attention to this important history that they feel is neglected. So
Are you heading out there for any events?
yeah, in fact, next spring I think the book's coming out next. I'm not sure which month it is next spring, but in Italian. So I'm going to have a launch at the University of Naples sometime next spring. So yes,
Fantastic. And
yeah.
then presumably it sounds like there's a career in the Napoli tourist board for you if you it's but it is a wonderful city. I've been. I loved it.
It's a fantastic city. It's one of the few major cities in Italy, well, sort of major sort of tourist cities, because
Because
Naples
of
has always
Pompeii,
it's
obviously,
always
isn't
been a
it? Yeah.
tourist city. But unlike Florence, for example, where you go into the center, you hardly see any Italian people because nobody lives there anymore. It's a bit like central London. It's a place for tourists. But Naples isn't like that. It's still there. People live in the center. It's very densely populated in the center, in fact, and so it's not only got this amazing sort of baroque tourist vibe about it. It's also very authentic. It's a living, working city. It's great. I love it.
Great stuff. Well, Keith, this has been fantastic, and we haven't mentioned the fact that the volcano erupted,
Ha!
as if they hadn't had everything thrown at them. The volcano went up. It's just an incredible story.
Yeah, a food crisis, a typhus epidemic, war, hunger, inflation, prostitution, and then Vesuvius erupts. I mean, The poor people in Naples couldn't catch a break.
Yeah. Well, I think you've done them proud with this, Keith. It's fantastic. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Plenty more history on the way, so please do subscribe. And if you can, share with the like-minded. I'll be in your debt. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.